Hey guys, tonight, we begin with something a little unusual. Not kings, not queens, not dramatic battles or heroic last stands. No, tonight we gently drift into the strange, slightly uncomfortable, and very real world of medieval jobs. The kind no one wrote poems about, so go ahead. Dim the lights, maybe pull the blanket a little higher, and let your mind settle. Because as it turns out, someone had to keep medieval cities running. And unfortunately, that someone was often elbow-deep in things you really don't want to think about right before bed. Now, when people imagine medieval cities, they tend to picture charming cobblestone streets, maybe a little fog, some horses casually clopping along, and perhaps a market where everyone looks slightly underwashed but otherwise content. It's a nice image, very peaceful, very incorrect. Because medieval cities were not just messy, they were aggressively messy. The kind of messy that makes modern garbage day feel like a spa treatment. And since there were no proper sewage systems, no sanitation departments, and certainly no polite, please dispose of waste responsibly signs, well, the solution was simple. You hired a person. A very unlucky person. Let's start with one of the most quietly essential roles in any medieval town, the gong farmer. And no, despite the name, this had absolutely nothing to do with agriculture. The word gong was in medieval English, a polite-ish way of saying human waste. So a gong farmer was someone whose job was to remove, transport, and dispose of everything that came out of a city's toilets. And these weren't modern toilets, of course. They were cesspits, large, deep holes filled with, let's just say, centuries of collective regret. And when those pits got too full, which they inevitably did, someone had to climb in and empty them. That someone, again, was the gong farmer. And if you're wondering whether this was considered a prestigious career path, the answer is no, not even slightly. Gong farmers worked at night, partly to avoid the smell drifting too far during the day, and partly because no one really wanted to see them doing their job. It was a very out-of-sight, out-of-mind situation. They would dig out the waste using buckets and shovels, often standing waist-deep in it, because there was no other way. And then they would haul it outside the city walls, where it could be dumped or sometimes even sold as fertilizer. Yes, medieval recycling was very much a thing. Just not the kind you'd brag about. What's quietly fascinating, though, is that gong farmers were actually paid relatively well. Because, as it turns out, if a job is unpleasant enough, people will eventually agree to compensate you properly. They were also somewhat surprisingly regulated. There were laws about where waste could be dumped and how often cesspits had to be cleaned. So while the job itself was deeply unglamorous, it came with a certain level of importance. Without gong farmers, cities would quite literally drown in their own filth, so in a strange way, they were the unsung heroes of medieval urban life. Just heroes no one wanted to hug. Now drifting gently away from cesspits, but not too far. Because medieval life rarely allowed that, we come to another curious profession, the rat catcher. And this one, at least, sounds a bit more adventurous, almost like a character from a story. But the reality was less charming and more constant. Medieval cities were full of rats, not just a few here and there. Entire populations, thriving, multiplying, and generally doing very well for themselves. And since rats carried disease, most famously the plague, someone had to keep their numbers under control. Rat catchers used a mix of traps, dogs, and sheer persistence. Some even developed reputations, becoming minor local celebrities for their ability to clear out infestations. But it was not an easy job. Rats are clever, adaptable, and very good at hiding, so a rat catcher's work was never really finished. It was more like an ongoing negotiation with a species that refused to leave. And while we might imagine this as a slightly grim but manageable task, it's worth remembering that these were not small, timid creatures. Medieval rats could grow quite large, and they were not particularly afraid of humans. So every day was, in its own quiet way, a battle. And then there were the tanners. Now at first glance, tanning leather doesn't sound especially strange. It's a craft, a trade, something practical, but the process itself, well, that's where things get interesting. Because turning animal hides into usable leather required a series of steps that were, to put it gently, extremely unpleasant. After removing the fur, the hides had to be soaked in a mixture that often included urine. Yes, human urine, collected, stored, and used in large quantities. Because it contains ammonia, which helps break down the remaining tissue. So imagine, if you will, a workshop filled with vats of soaking hides, all gently bubbling away in this mixture. The smell was unforgettable. So unforgettable, in fact, that tanneries were usually located on the outskirts of towns, far away from polite society. Tanners themselves were often treated as social outsiders, not because they had done anything wrong, but simply because they carried the scent of their work with them. It clung to their clothes, their skin, their entire existence. So even when they weren't working, they kind of still were. Let's float, slowly, to another role that feels almost poetic until you think about it for more than a few seconds. The knocker-up. Now this job appeared later, but its roots can be traced back to medieval habits. Before alarm clocks, people relied on other people to wake them up. And while in later centuries this became a more formal occupation, even in medieval times there were individuals who took on the responsibility of waking others for work, prayers, or important duties. They would walk through the streets early in the morning, tapping on windows or doors with long sticks. A gentle, persistent reminder that it was time to face another day, whether you liked it or not. It sounds almost peaceful. A quiet figure moving through the dawn, tapping softly, ensuring the rhythm of the city continued. But it also hints at something deeper. A world where time was shared, communal, and enforced not by devices, but by people. And those people, again, were doing a job that no one else particularly wanted. Because waking someone up is never a universally appreciated act, especially when that someone is tired, cold, and very much not ready to leave their bed. Now, as we continue this slow journey through medieval occupations, it becomes clear that many of these roles existed because no one had yet invented a better solution. There were no machines to handle waste, no chemicals to simplify processes, no systems to streamline daily life. So everything fell to human hands. And those hands belonged, more often than not, to people on the edges of society. People whose work was necessary, but whose presence was quietly avoided. And yet, there's something oddly grounding about all of this. A reminder that beneath the crowns and castles, beneath the grand narratives of history, there was a constant, unglamorous effort to keep things functioning. To clean, to maintain, to manage. And while these jobs might seem strange to us now, they were simply part of life back then. Just as normal, in their own way, as checking your phone or making coffee in the morning. So as you settle a little deeper, letting these images drift gently through your mind, take a moment to appreciate the quiet persistence of these workers. The gong farmers, the rat catchers, the tanners, and the early risers tapping on windows. They didn't leave behind great monuments or famous quotes. But without them, medieval cities would have come to a very unpleasant standstill. As we gently continue drifting through the back alleys of medieval life, it becomes clear that we've only just scratched the surface. Because if you thought climbing into cesspits or soaking hides in questionable liquids was the peak of human occupational creativity, well, medieval cities had a way of quietly saying, "Oh, we can do worse." And not in a dramatic, shocking way, but in a slow, almost matter-of-fact acceptance that someone, somewhere, would have to do these things. And of course, someone always did. Let's begin with the wonderfully specific and slightly unsettling role of the fuller. Now, at first, this might sound harmless. Fulling cloth, cleaning it, preparing it for use. Very respectable, very normal. But the process itself, once again, tells a different story. Because to clean and thicken woolen cloth, Foolers would soak it in a mixture that often included stale urine. Yes, once again, urine makes a quiet but consistent appearance in medieval industry. It was collected from households, stored in vats, and then used to break down oils and dirt in the fabric. And if you're imagining a nice tidy workshop with neatly folded fabrics, you might want to adjust that image slightly. Because foolers didn't just soak the cloth. They stomped on it for hours, sometimes in large communal vats, rhythmically stepping, pressing, and working the material with their feet. It was physical, repetitive, and let's be honest, not exactly fragrant work. And while it was essential, because everyone needed clothes, after all, it placed foolers in that familiar category of important, but best kept at a distance. You could almost picture them at the edge of town, quietly doing their thing, while everyone else pretended not to think too hard about how their nice, clean garments came to be. Now drifting slightly from cloth to something a bit more organic, we arrive at the job of the leech collector, and this one feels almost poetic in its simplicity. Before modern medicine, leeches were widely used for bloodletting, a practice believed to balance the body's humors. So naturally, there was a steady demand for these small, wriggling creatures. And to meet that demand, someone had to go out and collect them. By hand, from ponds, marshes, and slow-moving streams. And here's where it gets quietly uncomfortable. Because the easiest way to collect leeches was to let them attach to your own skin. So leech collectors would wade into the water, often barefoot, and simply wait. The leeches would find them, latch on, and begin their work. After a while, the collector would pull them off and store them for sale. It was a job that required patience, resilience, and a very specific tolerance for discomfort. And while it might sound almost serene standing in still water, surrounded by nature, it was also a slow, steady process of being gently eaten. Let's float now to a role that feels almost theatrical, the Sin Eater. And yes, this is exactly as strange as it sounds. In some parts of medieval and early modern Europe, there existed a belief that a person's sins could be transferred to another individual through a ritual involving food. So when someone died, a sin eater would be called. They would sit by the body, consume a piece of bread and drink, and in doing so, symbolically take on the sins of the deceased. Which, if you think about it for more than a moment, is quite a heavy responsibility for what is essentially a very quiet meal. Sin eaters were often social outcasts, people who lived on the margins, taking on a role that others found both necessary and deeply unsettling. They were paid for their service, but rarely respected, because while everyone appreciated the idea of sins being removed, no one was particularly eager to associate with the person who now carried them. It's one of those jobs that feels almost symbolic of medieval life as a whole. A strange blend of practicality, belief, and quiet discomfort. Now, easing away from the spiritual and back into the physical world, we encounter the night soil man, and if that sounds familiar, it's because this role overlaps quite a bit with the gong farmer. But in larger cities, the task became more specialized. Night soil men were responsible for collecting human waste from households, often transported in buckets and removing it from the city. They worked under cover of darkness, moving through the streets with carts, performing a task that was both essential and, once again, deeply avoided by everyone else. And what's interesting here is the rhythm of it all. The quiet movement at night, the steady routine, the understanding that this work had to be done regularly to keep the city functioning. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't celebrated, but it was reliable. And in a world where so much was uncertain, that reliability mattered, even if it came with a smell that lingered far longer than anyone would have liked. Let's gently shift now to something that sounds almost whimsical. Until you think about it for a second, the toad doctor. In medieval medicine, animals were often believed to hold special properties. And toads, in particular, were associated with both poison and healing. So there were individuals who specialized in using toads for medicinal purposes. They would dry them, grind them, or use them in various preparations, all based on the belief that they could draw out illness or protect against disease. It's the kind of job that makes you pause, just for a moment, and wonder how someone even discovers this as a career path. Ah yes, I shall work with toads. But in the context of the time, it made sense. Medicine was a mix of observation, tradition, and a fair amount of guesswork. And if something seemed to work, even occasionally, it became part of the system. So the toad doctor quietly went about their business, blending the strange with the practical in a way that feels uniquely medieval. Now, drifting onward, we come to the executioner. And while this role might seem more obvious, it still carries its own peculiar weight. Executioners were responsible for carrying out legal punishments, often in very public settings. But what's interesting is not just the job itself, but the social position it created. Executioners were both necessary and deeply avoided. They performed a function that the legal system required, yet they were often shunned by society. They lived on the edges of towns, married within small circles, and were sometimes forbidden from participating in normal community life. And yet, they were skilled professionals. A good executioner was valued for their ability to perform their task efficiently and ideally with minimal suffering. So here we have another example of a job that sits in that strange space between importance and isolation. Needed, but never quite accepted. Let's take a softer turn now, to something a bit less grim, but still quietly unusual: the professional mourner. In some medieval cultures, funerals included individuals who were paid to express grief. Loudly, dramatically, they would wail, cry, and perform sorrow in a way that ensured the deceased was properly honored. Because, of course, grief was not just a private emotion, it was a public display. And if a family couldn't produce enough visible sorrow, they could hire someone who could. It's a role that feels almost theatrical, like a performance within a ritual, and yet it served a purpose. It reinforced social expectations, provided a sense of closure, and ensured that the moment was marked with appropriate intensity, even if that intensity was, in some cases, carefully arranged. And again, we see that blend of practicality and symbolism that runs through so many medieval jobs. Now, as we continue this slow, steady journey, it becomes clear that medieval cities were held together by a network of roles that were unusual, yes, but also deeply human. Each one a response to a need. Each one carried out by someone who, for one reason or another, found themselves in that position. And while the details might seem strange to us now, the underlying idea is familiar. Society functions because people do the work that needs to be done, even when that work is less than ideal. And so, as you let your thoughts drift a little further, imagine these figures moving through their daily routines. The fooler, stepping steadily in his vat. The leech collector, standing quietly in the water. The sin-eater, finishing a solemn meal. The night soil man, guiding his cart through silent streets. Each one part of a larger, quieter story. A story not of grand events, but of small, necessary actions repeated over time. And with that gentle rhythm in mind, we'll continue onward, because there are still more roles to explore, and somehow, they only get stranger from here. As we continue to drift, slowly and comfortably, through the narrow streets of medieval cities, it becomes clear that we haven't yet reached the true edge of human creativity. Because the deeper you go into this world, the more you start to notice something quite curious. Medieval people had a solution for everything. Not always a good solution, but definitely a solution. And more often than not, that solution involved giving someone a job that makes you pause, tilt your head slightly, and quietly wonder, how did this become a profession? Let's begin with the rather oddly specific role of the chimney sweep. Now, at first glance, this doesn't seem too unusual. Chimneys get dirty, someone cleans them. Perfectly reasonable. But medieval chimneys were narrow, often uneven, and filled with thick layers of soot that built up over time. And since there were no fancy tools or modern equipment, the cleaning process required, well, a human body, usually a small one. So chimney sweeps were often young boys, sent crawling up inside these tight, dark shafts, scraping away soot with simple tools, sometimes with nothing more than their hands. It was a job that required flexibility, endurance, and a certain acceptance of discomfort. Imagine climbing through a narrow, pitch-black tunnel, coated in soot, with barely enough room to move. The air thick, the walls pressing in, and the understanding that this was just another day at work. It's one of those roles that feels almost surreal when viewed from a distance. Necessary, yes, but also a quiet reminder of how different daily life could be, when the only available tool was the human body itself. Now drifting gently away from chimneys, we arrive at a role that feels almost philosophical in its oddness: the pardoner. Pardoners were individuals authorized by the church to sell indulgences. These indulgences were, essentially, certificates that claimed to reduce a person's time in purgatory. So if you had committed sins, and let's be honest, most people had, you could, in theory, purchase a bit of spiritual relief. It's a system that sounds almost too convenient. And of course, it often was. Pardoners traveled from town to town, carrying documents, relics, and sometimes very creative stories about their powers. And while the official idea was rooted in religious doctrine, the practical reality often leaned heavily into performance. A good pardoner wasn't just a salesperson. They were a storyteller, a persuader, someone who could stand in front of a crowd and gently convince them that a small donation could have very large, eternal benefits, which, when you think about it, is quite a remarkable skill set. Let's float now to a job that feels both oddly charming and slightly unnecessary: the town crier. In a world without newspapers, radios, or notifications quietly buzzing in your pocket, information had to be delivered in person, loudly. So the town crier would walk through the streets, ringing a bell and announcing news, decrees, and important events. Hear thee, and all that. It's the kind of role that feels almost theatrical, like something from a play. But it was also essential, because information was power, and without a reliable way to spread it, a city could quickly fall into confusion. So the town crier became a familiar figure, a voice that people recognized, someone who stood at the center of communication in a very literal sense. And while it might seem like a simple job, just speaking loudly, it required clarity, memory, and a certain presence, because if people didn't listen, the message was lost. Now easing into something a bit more unusual, we encounter the bear leader. And yes, this involves an actual bear. In some parts of medieval Europe, it was common for wealthy families to send their sons on extended journeys for education and experience. And occasionally, these young men would be accompanied by a tutor or guardian, humorously referred to as a bear leader. The term suggested that guiding a young nobleman was somewhat similar to managing a large, unpredictable animal, which, based on historical accounts, wasn't entirely inaccurate. These bear leaders were responsible for education, discipline, and general supervision, a task that required patience, intelligence, and perhaps a very calm demeanor, because young nobles far from home, with access to money and very few immediate consequences, could be, let's say, creatively troublesome. So the bear leader's role was to gently steer them towards something resembling maturity, or at least prevent too many disasters along the way. Let's drift now into a role that feels almost like something out of a dream: the alewife. These were women who brewed and sold ale, often from their own homes. And while brewing might sound straightforward, the alewife's job was surprisingly complex. They had to manage ingredients, control fermentation, and ensure that the final product was drinkable, which was not always guaranteed. Medieval ale could vary wildly in quality, from pleasantly refreshing to mildly concerning. Alewives were also subject to regulation. Officials would inspect their products, sometimes using very creative methods to test quality. And if the ale was found lacking, there could be fines or other consequences. So while the role had a certain charm, imagine a cozy home with barrels of brewing ale that also came with pressure. Because in a world where safe drinking water wasn't always available, ale was a daily staple. And people took it seriously. Now slowly moving forward, we come to the grave digger. And while this might seem like a straightforward job, in medieval times it carried its own quiet weight. Digging graves by hand, often in crowded churchyards, required both physical effort and a certain familiarity with mortality. It was a job that kept you constantly aware of life's fragility. In a very literal, very immediate way. Grave diggers worked in all conditions, preparing resting places for people from all walks of life. And while their role was essential, it was also somewhat isolating. Much like the executioner or the gong farmer, they existed on the edges of social comfort. Because while everyone understood the necessity of their work, not everyone wanted to think about it too much. Let's gently shift to something a bit more specialized, the arrow maker or fletcher. Now this might sound like a more traditional craft, and in many ways it was. But the precision required was remarkable. Each arrow had to be carefully balanced, straightened, and fitted with feathers in just the right way. Because in a time when archery was both a sport and a military necessity, a poorly made arrow could have serious consequences. Fletchers worked with patience and skill, producing tools that would travel far beyond their workshops. And while their job might not seem strange at first glance, it becomes more interesting when you consider the sheer volume of arrows required. Wars, training, hunting, all demanded a constant supply. So the fletcher's work was never really done. It was a steady, ongoing process of creation. Now as we begin to settle into the rhythm of these roles, one thing becomes increasingly clear. Medieval jobs were not just about function. They were about adaptation, about finding ways to meet needs with the resources available. And sometimes, those solutions were a little unusual, or a little uncomfortable, or both. And yet, there's something quietly admirable about it. The willingness to step into these roles, to do the work that others avoided, to keep the system moving. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't celebrated, but it was necessary. And in that necessity, there's a kind of quiet dignity, even if it comes with soot, or strange rituals, or the occasional unpredictable nobleman. So as you let your thoughts drift a little further, imagine these figures once again. The chimney sweep, emerging from the darkness. The pardoner, sharing his carefully crafted words. The town crier, ringing his bell. The alewife, tending her brew. Each one part of a world that feels distant, and yet, in some small way, familiar. As we continue to drift, a little slower now, a little deeper into this oddly detailed world, it starts to feel like medieval cities were not just places, but entire ecosystems of very specific responsibilities. Every small problem, every minor inconvenience, every slightly awkward situation, somehow turned into a job. And not just a vague role, but a very clearly defined one. The kind where you could probably introduce yourself at a gathering and say, "Ah yes, I handle that extremely niche issue," and everyone would nod politely. While taking a small step back, let's begin with the latrine attendant. Now, we've already met the gong farmer and the night soil man, so you might think we've covered all aspects of medieval sanitation. But no, there were layers to this. The latrine attendant was responsible for maintaining public toilets, particularly in larger towns or castles. This meant ensuring they were usable, which, given the circumstances, was already quite a challenge. It also meant managing the steady flow of people, keeping things from becoming completely unmanageable, and occasionally dealing with situations that we will not describe in detail, because this is meant to be relaxing. It's one of those jobs that quietly sits at the intersection of necessity and endurance. Because while everyone needed to use these facilities, very few people wanted to think about who kept them functioning. And yet, without the latrine attendant, things would very quickly descend into chaos. So once again, we have a role that is both essential and politely ignored. Now drifting gently to something that sounds almost cheerful. we arrive at the bell ringer. This might seem like a pleasant occupation. Ringing bells in a tall tower, marking the hours, calling people to prayer. And in many ways, it was. There's something rhythmic and calming about the idea. But the reality involved climbing narrow staircases, often multiple times a day, in all kinds of weather. And once at the top, the job required physical strength. These were not small bells. They were large, heavy, and required effort to ring properly. Bell ringers also carried a certain responsibility. Their timing had to be accurate, their signals clear. Because in a world without clocks on every wall, the sound of the bell was how people understood time. So while the job might seem simple, it required consistency and attention. And perhaps a willingness to spend a lot of time. Slightly out of breath. Let's float now to a role that feels almost poetic in its oddness. The dog whipper. And yes, this was a real job. In medieval churches, dogs would sometimes wander in during services, which, while charming in theory, could be quite disruptive. So the dog whipper was tasked with encouraging them to leave, usually with a whipper stick, though ideally without causing harm. Just enough persuasion to remind the dog that this was not the place for a casual visit. It's the kind of role that feels both unnecessary and completely understandable at the same time. Because of course dogs would wander in. And of course someone would have to deal with that, and naturally, that someone would become the official dog whipper, a title that probably didn't make for the most impressive introductions, but was nonetheless part of the system. Now easing into something a bit more aromatic, we encounter the spice grinder. Spices were incredibly valuable in medieval times. Not just for flavor, but for preservation and even medicine. And grinding them into usable forms required skill and patience. This wasn't just a matter of crushing a few seeds. It involved careful preparation, the use of specialized tools, and an understanding of how different spices behaved. Spice grinders worked in environments filled with strong lingering scents, cinnamon, cloves, pepper, all blending together into something quite intense. It's one of those jobs that might seem pleasant at first. Oh, you work with spices. How lovely. Until you realize that constant exposure can turn even the nicest aroma into something overwhelming. Still, it was a respected trade. Because spices were luxury items, and handling them required trust. Let's drift now to a role that feels almost unnecessarily complicated. The water carrier. Before plumbing, water had to be transported manually. From wells, rivers, or public fountains to homes and businesses. And while many people fetched their own water, in larger cities there were individuals who did this professionally. Carrying heavy buckets, balancing loads, and making regular deliveries throughout the day. It was physically demanding work. Repetitive, steady, and essential. And like many medieval jobs, it existed because there was simply no alternative. If you needed water and couldn't fetch it yourself, you hired someone who could. It's a simple idea, but one that highlights how much effort went into tasks we now consider effortless. Now slowly moving forward, we come to the scavenger. And while this term might sound familiar, in medieval cities it had a very specific meaning. Scavengers were responsible for keeping streets clean, removing waste, debris, and anything that didn't belong. It was a constant task, because the streets were always being used, always accumulating things. Scavengers worked in the background, maintaining a level of order that allowed the city to function. Without them, movement would become difficult, conditions would worsen, and daily life would be far less manageable. So once again, we see a role that is both humble and vital, quietly supporting everything else. Let's gently shift to something a bit more peculiar, the relic seller. In a deeply religious society, relics, objects associated with saints or holy figures, were highly valued. And there was, unsurprisingly, a market for them. Relic sellers traveled, traded, and sometimes stretched the truth a little. Because the demand for holy objects was high, and the supply was, well, limited. So this job sat somewhere between commerce and storytelling. A relic seller needed to present their items convincingly, to inspire belief, and to navigate a world where authenticity was not always easy to verify. It's one of those roles that feels both fascinating and slightly questionable. But again, it fulfilled a need. Now as we continue this slow journey, a pattern begins to emerge. Medieval jobs were often deeply tied to immediate, practical concerns. Cleanliness, timekeeping, resource management, social order. And for each concern, there was someone responsible. Someone who stepped into that role and made it their daily routine. And perhaps that's what makes all of this feel so strangely calming, the predictability of it. The idea that even in a world that could be chaotic and uncertain, there were these steady rhythms, bells ringing, water being carried, streets being cleaned, dogs being gently escorted out of churches, life continuing, one small task at a time. So as you settle a little deeper, letting these quiet images pass by, remember that behind every grand story of history, there were countless smaller ones. Stories of people doing very specific jobs in very specific ways, simply because those jobs needed to be done. As we continue to drift, a little slower now, almost as if the streets themselves are growing quieter, we start to notice something else about medieval life. Not only were there jobs for every possible situation, there were also jobs for problems that feel oddly specific. The kind of problems you wouldn't even think about, until suddenly someone appears whose entire role is to deal with exactly that one thing. And you just accept it. Because of course, someone had to. Let's begin with the rather curious role of the piss prophet. Now, despite the name sounding like something out of a strange dream, this was actually a form of medical practice. These individuals, often physicians or self-proclaimed experts, would diagnose illnesses by examining a person's urine. The color, the smell, the texture, everything was carefully observed. And from this, conclusions were drawn, sometimes quite confidently. Patients would bring samples in small flasks, and the piss prophet, who again, was just doing their job, would hold it up to the light, perhaps swirl it gently, and then deliver an assessment of the patient's condition. It's a scene that feels both oddly scientific and deeply questionable at the same time. But in a world without modern diagnostics, this was considered a valid method. And so, quietly, this became a respected, or at least accepted, profession. Now drifting gently away from that, we arrive at a role that feels almost domestic, but with a medieval twist, the lice picker. Personal hygiene in medieval times was, let's say, inconsistent, and lice were a common issue. So some individuals made a living by carefully removing lice from others. It required patience, attention to detail, and a certain level of acceptance. You can imagine the scene. Someone sitting quietly, perhaps in a market or a home, while the lice picker works methodically, searching, removing, and ensuring a slightly more comfortable existence. It's not glamorous. It's not something people would boast about, but it was useful. And in a world where small discomforts were part of daily life, even a small improvement mattered. Let's float now to something that sounds almost noble. Until you think about it for a moment, the herald. Heralds were responsible for making official announcements, organizing tournaments, and identifying coats of arms. They were experts in symbols, lineage, and ceremony. And while this might seem like a prestigious role, and in many ways it was, it also involved a surprising amount of very detailed memorization and constant travel. Heralds had to recognize who was who belonged to which family, and what symbols represented them. Because in a world of armor and helmets, visual identification was not always easy. So the herald stood at the edge of chaos, calmly explaining who everyone was. It's a job that feels almost like being a walking, talking directory, but with far more importance than you'd expect. Now, easing into something a bit more grounded, we encounter the hay ward. This was a person responsible for protecting crops and managing common land. They ensured that animals didn't wander into fields where they didn't belong, and that boundaries were respected. It sounds simple, But it required constant vigilance, because animals, as it turns out, are not particularly concerned with property lines. So the Hayward would patrol, observe, and gently enforce order, a quiet presence in the landscape, ensuring that things remained as they should be. It's one of those roles that doesn't draw attention, but without it, small problems could quickly grow into larger ones. Let's drift now into a role that feels almost strangely comforting: the candle maker. Before electricity, candles were essential for light, for warmth, for daily life. And making them was a careful process. It involved melting fat or wax, dipping wicks repeatedly, and ensuring a consistent shape. It was repetitive, steady work, almost meditative. Candle makers worked with patience, creating objects that would quietly illuminate the lives of others. And while the job itself might not seem strange, it becomes more interesting when you consider how central it was. Every evening, every dark corner, every quiet moment depended on their work. A small flame, made possible by someone who spent their days shaping wax. Now slowly moving forward, we come to the turnspit dog handler, and this one is particularly unique. In large kitchens, especially in castles, meat was often roasted on spits over open fires. To keep the spit turning evenly, a mechanism was needed, and sometimes that mechanism involved a dog running inside a wheel, much like a hamster. So the handler's job was to manage these dogs, to ensure they kept moving, to care for them, and to maintain the system. It's a role that feels both inventive and slightly absurd, because instead of building a machine, medieval society simply used a dog, and then assigned someone to oversee the process. Let's gently shift to something a bit more intellectual: the scribe. Now, this might not seem strange at first, but when you consider the conditions, it becomes more interesting. Scribes spent long hours copying texts by hand, carefully, precisely, letter by letter. It required focus, discipline, and a steady hand. And while the work itself was important, preserving knowledge, creating records, it was also incredibly repetitive. Imagine sitting in a quiet room, day after day, copying the same patterns, the same words. It's almost hypnotic. A slow, steady rhythm that feels perfectly suited to the calm tone of our journey tonight. Now drifting onward, we encounter the apothecary. These were early pharmacists, preparing remedies from herbs, minerals, and other ingredients. And while some treatments were effective, others were, let's say, experimental. But the apothecary worked with care, blending, measuring, and offering solutions to those in need. It's a role that sits at the edge of science and tradition, a place where knowledge was still growing, still evolving. And yet, it was trusted, because in a world with limited options, even an uncertain remedy was better than none. As we settle deeper into this quiet exploration, one thing becomes increasingly clear. Medieval jobs were not just about survival. They were about adaptation, creativity, and a willingness to step into roles that might seem unusual, but were entirely necessary at the time. And there's something oddly soothing about that idea. The sense that every small task, every specific responsibility, contributed to the larger picture. That even the strangest jobs had a place, a purpose, a rhythm. So as you let your thoughts drift a little further, imagine these figures once again. The piss prophet, quietly observing. The lice picker, working patiently. The candle maker, shaping soft light. The turnspit dog running steadily in its wheel. Each one part of a world that feels distant, yet quietly alive. As we begin to slow down, just a little, you might notice that the world around us feels quieter now. The streets are still there, the soft echo of footsteps, the distant murmur of daily life. But there's a sense that we've seen enough. Not everything. Of course, medieval life had an endless supply of oddly specific roles, but enough to understand the pattern. Enough to see how this entire system held itself together. Not with grand ideas, but with very ordinary people doing very unusual things. Let's begin this final stretch with the rag and bone collector. Now this was someone who moved through the city collecting discarded items, cloth, bones, scraps, anything that could be reused or sold. In a world where waste wasn't simply thrown away, but quietly repurposed, this job played an important role. Bones could be turned into tools or glue. Rags could be used in papermaking. Almost everything had a second life, if someone was willing to gather it. So the rag and bone collector walked slowly through the streets, observing, picking up what others had left behind. It's a job that feels almost reflective. A quiet reminder that even the unwanted had value, that nothing was entirely useless. And in a way, it mirrors our journey tonight. Taking small, overlooked pieces of history and giving them a moment of attention. Now, drifting gently forward, we come to the Scold's Bridal Enforcer, and this one sits in a slightly uncomfortable space. In medieval towns, there were officials responsible for maintaining public order, not just in terms of crime, but behavior. And one of the more peculiar tools used for this was the Scold's Bridle, a device meant to punish excessive talking or gossiping, usually applied to women. The enforcer's role was to carry out these orders. It's not a pleasant job to think about, and we won't linger on it. But it does quietly remind us that many medieval roles were tied not just to practical needs, but to social control, to expectations, to the ways people believed society should function, and those beliefs shaped jobs just as much as any physical necessity. Let's move gently to something lighter. The minstrel. Now this feels like a more familiar figure. Traveling performers who sang songs, told stories, and brought a bit of entertainment to everyday life. But even here, there's something quietly interesting. Because being a minstrel wasn't always glamorous. It involved constant travel, uncertain income, and the need to adapt to different audiences. One night you might be performing in a grand hall, surrounded by nobles. The next in a crowded tavern, hoping for a few coins. It was a life of movement, of storytelling, of carrying culture from one place to another. And while it might seem romantic from a distance, it was also unpredictable. Still, in a world filled with routine and responsibility, the minstrel offered something rare. A moment of escape. Now as we continue to slow our pace, we arrive at the fire watcher. In medieval cities, fire was a constant risk. Buildings were made of wood, streets were narrow, and open flames were everywhere. So there were individuals tasked with watching for signs of fire, especially at night. They would patrol, observe, and raise the alarm if needed. It's a role built on vigilance. Quiet, steady awareness. The understanding that a single unnoticed spark could change everything. And so the fire watcher moved through the darkness, not seeking attention, but preventing disaster. A calm presence in a potentially dangerous world. Let's drift now to the locksmith. Again, this might not sound strange at first, but consider the context. Security in medieval times was very physical. Locks were handcrafted, unique, and often quite intricate. A locksmith wasn't just making keys, they were creating systems of protection in a world where safety depended on craftsmanship. Each lock was a small puzzle, each key a solution. And the locksmith worked with precision, shaping metal into something that could keep belongings safe. It's a quiet, focused job. One that required skill, patience, and a deep understanding of mechanics. Long before modern engineering. Now, easing further into this calm conclusion, we come to the bread taster. In larger households or royal settings, there were individuals responsible for tasting food before it was served, to ensure it wasn't poisoned. And while this might sound dramatic, in practice, it was simply part of daily precaution. The bread taster would sample food, wait, observe, and confirm its safety. A role built on trust, and perhaps a certain level of bravery. Though ideally, nothing ever went wrong. Because the best outcome was always nothing happening at all. Let's gently shift to one final, quietly symbolic role, the bridge keeper. Bridges were vital for trade and movement, and someone had to maintain them, collect tolls, and ensure they remained usable. The bridge keeper stood at a point of connection, watching people come and go, goods passing through, life flowing from one place to another. It's a peaceful image. A small structure over water, a figure standing nearby, quietly doing their job. Not rushing, not demanding attention, just being there. Ensuring that the path remains open. And as we take a step back, slowly, it becomes clear that all of these roles, no matter how strange or specific, were part of a larger rhythm. A system built not on perfection, but on persistence. On people showing up, day after day, and doing what needed to be done. There's something deeply human about that. The idea that even in a world without modern convenience, without technology, without the systems we rely on today, life continued. Not smoothly, not perfectly, but steadily. So, as you settle into this final moment, letting your thoughts grow softer, imagine those medieval streets one last time. The quiet movement, the distant sounds, the presence of all these individuals, each with their own role, their own routine. The gong farmer finishing his work before dawn, the bell ringer marking the hour, the minstrel tuning his instrument, the fire watcher scanning the night, the bridge keeper standing patiently as the world passes by. None of them famous. None of them remembered in grand history books, but all of them necessary. And perhaps that's the most calming thought of all, that history isn't just made by kings and queens. It's made by ordinary people, doing very unusual jobs. One quiet day at a time, and with that, we can gently let this story come to rest. If you slow things down just a little, and imagine an ancient battlefield, it rarely looks like the clean, organized maps we see in history books. It's not neat lines and tidy formations. It's dust in the air, shouting that doesn't quite make sense, and a general feeling that no one fully knows what is happening. And somewhere in that chaos, there is always someone who decides, very quietly at first, that they've had enough. Not in a dramatic way, not with a speech, just a small step backward, then another, and then suddenly, they're walking away from the whole thing. Now, desertion or simply running away from battle is often treated as this rare act of cowardice. But the truth is far less dramatic and far more human. In ancient armies, especially in places like early kingdoms and tribal societies, soldiers were not always professionals. Many were farmers, craftsmen, or just unlucky men pulled into conflict because someone important had a disagreement. So when things started going badly, or even just confusingly, leaving the battlefield wasn't always a grand moral failure. Sometimes it was just a decision made in a moment of fear, exhaustion, or very practical self-preservation. Of course, armies didn't exactly encourage this kind of thinking. Even in the earliest organized forces, commanders understood that once one person started to leave, others might follow. Fear spreads quickly, faster than courage, in most cases. So punishments for fleeing were introduced very early on. In some ancient Greek armies, a soldier who ran could be publicly shamed, fined, or stripped of his rights, which, in a society that valued honor quite a lot, was almost worse than physical punishment. You didn't just lose your place in the army, you lost your place in society. And yet, people still ran, because no matter how strict the rules became, the reality of standing in a line while sharp objects come flying toward you has a way of overriding long-term consequences. There are accounts from various ancient battles where entire sections of an army simply dissolved. Not in a dramatic collapse, but more like a quiet agreement. One person turns, another notices, and before long, a small group is heading in the opposite direction, hoping no one important is watching too closely. The Romans, as usual, tried to systematize the problem. They had rules for everything, including what to do if a soldier decided that battle was not for him. Roman discipline was famously strict, and punishments could be severe. One of the more unsettling practices was decimation. If a unit showed cowardice or fled, 1 out of every 10 men could be executed. Chosen by their own comrades, it was meant to be a deterrent. And it probably worked, in a grim sort of way. But even then, desertion never fully disappeared. Because fear, as it turns out, is quite resistant to policy. What's interesting is that not all fleeing soldiers were treated equally. Context mattered. If an entire army retreated under orders, that was strategy. If a group broke ranks during a clearly lost battle, sometimes commanders looked the other way. After all, dead soldiers are not particularly useful. But if someone ran too early, or without permission, or in a way that made others nervous, then the punishment tended to arrive quickly and quite publicly. In medieval times, things became even more complicated. Armies were often made up of a mix of professional soldiers, mercenaries, and feudal levies, basically men who owed military service to a lord. Loyalty was not always strong. Payment was sometimes late, and the risks were, as always, very real. So desertion was common enough that entire systems developed to try and prevent it. Oaths were sworn, contracts were signed. And still, at the first sign of things going wrong, some soldiers quietly slipped away. Mercenaries in particular had a somewhat flexible relationship with the concept of staying in battle. If the pay was good and the odds were decent, they fought well. If not, well, they had very little emotional attachment to the cause. There are multiple accounts of mercenary units simply leaving mid-campaign because they hadn't been paid. Not even in anger, more in a calm, practical sense. Like deciding to leave a job that wasn't working out. Unfortunately for everyone else, this often happened at the worst possible moment. For those who were caught fleeing, the consequences varied widely depending on time and place. Some were executed on the spot. Others were branded, marked in a way that made their past very visible. In certain armies, deserters could be forced into the most dangerous tasks if they were allowed to return at all. Essentially, they were given a chance to redeem themselves by doing something extremely risky. It was not a particularly generous system, but it did offer a narrow path back. And then there were the ones who got away completely. The soldiers who left the battlefield, avoided capture, and simply disappeared. These men often had to start new lives elsewhere, sometimes far from home, because returning was not always an option. In many societies, desertion was not just a military crime, it was a social stain. So they became something else. Farmers in a distant village, laborers in a growing town, people who never spoke much about their past, and who, when asked, gave very simple answers. As we drift through these early stories, it becomes clear that fleeing the battlefield was never just about cowardice. It was about fear, yes, but also about survival, confusion, and sometimes even quiet calculation. Not every battle was worth dying in. Not every cause felt meaningful to the person holding the spear. And in those moments, when the noise grew too loud and the ground felt too uncertain, some soldiers chose the only control they had left. They turned around and walked away. As we gently move forward, the story doesn't suddenly become clearer or more heroic. If anything, it becomes more structured in a slightly uncomfortable way. Because once rulers and generals realized that soldiers had this persistent habit of leaving at the worst possible moments, they began trying to control not just behavior, but fear itself. Which, as you might imagine, is a bit like trying to organize the wind. Still, they tried. Very seriously. By the late medieval period and into the early modern age, armies were becoming more formal. Not necessarily more pleasant, just more organized. Kings started keeping standing armies instead of relying only on temporary levies. And with that came paperwork, rules, and expectations. A soldier was no longer just some guy with a weapon. He was part of a system. And systems, of course, do not appreciate unexpected exits. So desertion began to be treated less like a personal failure and more like a direct threat to the state. Which sounds dramatic, but from a ruler's perspective, it made sense. If one soldier leaves, others might follow. And suddenly, your carefully arranged battle plan turns into a slow, awkward unraveling. Not ideal. So punishments became more standardized, and often more severe. In many European armies of the 16th and 17th centuries, Desertion during wartime was technically punishable by death. Not always carried out, but always present as a possibility. And it wasn't just a quiet execution either. Armies had a habit of making examples. Public punishments were very popular. The idea was simple. If everyone sees what happens to one deserter, perhaps they'll reconsider their own plans of quietly slipping away during the next battle. But even with all these rules, desertion remained surprisingly common. Because the conditions soldiers lived under were not exactly encouraging. Long marches, poor food, delayed pay, uncomfortable clothing, and the constant possibility of dying in a field somewhere far from home. It was not a glamorous profession, despite what later paintings might suggest. So when an opportunity appeared, a dark night, a distracted guard, a road leading somewhere else, many took it. Some armies tried a softer approach, not soft in a modern sense, just slightly less immediate death. For example, soldiers might be threatened with loss of pay, imprisonment, or forced labor instead of execution. There were also attempts to improve morale. Better rations, more regular pay, occasional promises of reward. Because someone eventually realized that a reasonably content soldier is slightly less likely to run away. Not entirely loyal, just less motivated to leave. There's also a quiet pattern that appears if you look closely. Soldiers were far more likely to desert before a battle than during one. Once the fighting actually began, things moved too quickly. Adrenaline took over. Commands were shouted, and there wasn't always a clear path to escape. But the night before, or the long march leading up to it, that's when the mind had time to wander, to imagine what might happen, to consider alternatives, and sometimes to decide that disappearing into the countryside seemed like a better plan. Interestingly, not all deserters were running from fear alone. Some were simply tired of the entire system, especially in wars that dragged on for years. A soldier might survive multiple battles, endure countless hardships, and eventually reach a point where continuing felt unnecessary, not dramatic, just unnecessary, so they left. Quietly, if possible, without making a scene. Because making a scene tended to end badly. Of course, being a deserter outside the army was not exactly easy either. Many regions had patrols or officials tasked with catching runaway soldiers. Papers were sometimes required to prove who you were and where you belonged. And if you couldn't provide them, questions followed, uncomfortable ones. So deserters often avoided towns and stayed on less traveled paths, blending in where they could, keeping their stories simple and their movements quiet. There were also cases where entire groups deserted together, not in a rebellious uprising, but more like a shared understanding. A small unit, perhaps underpaid or poorly treated, might collectively decide that they were done. And since punishing an entire group was more complicated than dealing with one individual, sometimes these situations were handled with a bit more flexibility, or at least less immediate severity. And then there's the curious case of soldiers who deserted and then came back. This happened more often than one might expect. A man might leave during a campaign, struggle to survive on his own, and eventually decide that returning to the army, with all its risks, was actually the more stable option. Some armies allowed this under strict conditions, others did not. But the pattern itself is telling. Life outside the system was not always easier. Just different. As we let this part settle, the picture becomes a little clearer, but not necessarily more comforting. Armies grew more organized, rules became stricter, punishments became more defined, and yet, the basic human response remained unchanged. Faced with danger, uncertainty, and exhaustion, some people stayed, and some people left, and no amount of regulation ever fully changed that balance. As we drift a little further forward, into the long stretched-out conflicts of the 17th and 18th centuries, something interesting begins to happen. Armies become larger, wars last longer, and soldiers start disappearing in ways that are less dramatic and far more routine. Not sudden bursts of panic on the battlefield, but slow, quiet vanishings during marsh, camp life, or even in the middle of otherwise uneventful days. Because by this point, war had become less about single decisive clashes and more about endurance. Campaigns could last for years. Armies moved across vast regions, setting up temporary camps, waiting for orders, waiting for supplies, waiting for something, anything to happen. And in all that waiting, soldiers had time to think. Which, as it turns out, is not always helpful when your job involves standing in formation while someone eventually tells you to risk your life. So desertion became less of a sudden reaction and more of a slow decision. A soldier might wake up one morning, look around at the same worn-out camp, the same tired faces, the same uncertain future, and simply decide that today was the day he would leave. No announcement, no dramatic farewell. Just a quiet step away from the group while no one was paying too much attention. Armies, of course, noticed this pattern, and they responded in very predictable ways. Roll calls became more frequent. Guards were posted more carefully. Camps were arranged in ways that made slipping away slightly more difficult. But slightly more difficult is not the same as impossible, especially when you have hundreds or thousands of men spread across a wide area, many of whom are already feeling disconnected from the cause they're supposed to be fighting for. There's also the matter of identity, or rather, how flexible it could be at the time. Unlike modern soldiers, many early modern troops did not carry standardized identification that could be easily verified across regions. Names could be common. Records could be inconsistent. And if a deserter managed to travel far enough, he could often blend into a new community without too many questions. Not perfectly, of course, but enough to start over, at least for a while. Some even joined other armies, which sounds almost unbelievable, but was surprisingly practical. If you already knew how to march, handle a weapon, and follow orders, you were useful. And in a time when many armies were constantly recruiting, a man with experience, even if his past was a bit complicated, could find a place. Loyalty in these cases was often less about deep personal commitment and more about who was currently paying. Of course, not all desertions were successful. Many soldiers were caught, sometimes quickly, sometimes after weeks of trying to stay hidden. And when they were brought back, the consequences were usually meant to be instructive. Punishments could include flogging, imprisonment, or forced service in particularly dangerous roles. Execution was still an option, especially during wartime, but it wasn't always the default. Armies needed soldiers, after all. Even unreliable ones were sometimes better than none. There's a slightly uncomfortable practicality to this. Commanders had to balance discipline with necessity. Punish too harshly, and you risk losing more men than you can replace. Be too lenient, and desertion might increase. So the system settled into something uneven. Some deserters faced severe consequences. Others were quietly reintegrated. And a few managed to avoid consequences entirely. Another detail that tends to be overlooked is how often desertion was linked to basic survival rather than fear of battle itself. Food shortages were common. Pay was unreliable. Illness spread easily in crowded camps. So for some soldiers, leaving wasn't about avoiding combat. It was about escaping the slow, grinding discomfort of army life. The battlefield was dangerous, yes, but so was staying in a place where your daily existence felt uncertain and exhausting. There are records from various European armies describing entire regions where deserters gathered. Not in organized groups, but as loose communities of former soldiers trying to get by. Some became laborers, others turned to small trades. A few, less fortunately, drifted into banditry, because options were limited and survival required flexibility. It's not the most romantic outcome, but it's a very consistent one. And then there were the moments when desertion became almost expected. During particularly long or unpopular wars, commanders sometimes planned with the assumption that a certain number of soldiers would leave over time. It was built into the system in a quiet, unspoken way. Not officially acknowledged, of course, but understood. Because after years of marching, waiting, and fighting, not everyone was going to stay until the very end. Interestingly, letters from soldiers of this period often reveal a kind of quiet internal negotiation. They don't always speak of fear in dramatic terms. Instead, they mention tiredness, homesickness, frustration, a sense that the war has stretched on too long, or that the reasons for it feel distant and unclear. And within those thoughts, the idea of leaving begins to take shape. Not as a sudden impulse, but as a gradual shift. As we let this part settle into place, the pattern becomes even more familiar. Desertion is no longer just a reaction to immediate danger. It's a response to time, to environment, to the slow accumulation of discomfort and uncertainty. And in that sense, it becomes almost predictable, given enough time, enough hardship, and enough distance from anything that feels meaningful. Some soldiers simply stop being soldiers. And they walk away. As we slowly drift into the late 18th and early 19th centuries, things begin to look more impressive on the surface. Uniforms become sharper, armies grow massive, and commanders, especially a certain very confident French emperor, start moving troops across entire continents as if they were pieces on a board. It all feels very grand, very organized, almost efficient. And yet, beneath all that structure, soldiers are still quietly slipping away, because the age of Napoleon Bonaparte did not eliminate desertion. If anything, it expanded the scale of it. His armies were enormous, drawn from across France and later from territories all over Europe, which meant that many soldiers were not volunteers in any meaningful sense. They were conscripts. Young men called up, given a uniform, and expected to march wherever they were told. Often very far from home, and conscripts, as it turns out, are not always deeply invested in imperial ambition. So while the Grande Armée looked impressive on paper, it had a quiet, persistent problem. Men disappearing during marches, not all at once, not dramatically. Just one here, two there. Sometimes a handful after a long day. Especially during those endless campaigns where the destination kept changing, and the reasons for being there became increasingly unclear. The marches themselves were often more exhausting than the battles. Days, sometimes weeks, of walking through unfamiliar landscapes, limited food, worn-out boots, and always the knowledge that at the end of the journey, there might be a battle waiting. Or worse, another march. So for many soldiers, the idea of simply stepping off the road at the right moment and not stepping back on became quietly appealing. Of course, the army tried to prevent this. Units were organized tightly. Officers kept careful watch. Stragglers were noted. But when you are moving tens of thousands of men across vast distances, perfect control becomes unrealistic. There are forests, villages, crossroads, moments when the line stretches too thin. And in those moments, a soldier could make a very small decision that changed everything. What makes this period particularly interesting is how common desertion became during difficult campaigns. Take, for example, the long march into Russia. On the way in, and especially on the way out, the army didn't just lose men to battle or weather. It lost them to absence. Men who simply vanished along the route. Some tried to survive in nearby settlements. Others attempted to make their way back west. Many were never heard from again, and it wasn't just the French. Opposing armies had the same issue. Large conscript forces meant that loyalty was often thin. A soldier might feel more connected to his village than to his commander. So when the opportunity arose, leaving felt less like betrayal, and more like returning to something familiar. Or at least trying to. Punishments naturally were still in place. Desertion could lead to execution, imprisonment, or forced labor. And commanders did occasionally make examples of those who were caught. But here's the quiet reality. When desertion becomes widespread, punishment becomes harder to enforce consistently. You can't execute thousands of soldiers without weakening your own army. So enforcement became uneven. Some were punished severely. Others were quietly ignored. A few were even brought back and reintegrated, because there simply weren't enough men to replace them. There's also a softer, almost accidental form of desertion that appears in this period. Soldiers who became separated from their units during marshes, retreats, or chaotic movements sometimes never found their way back. Not because they didn't want to, but because the army had already moved on. Communication was limited. Maps were not always reliable. And once you were alone, the line between lost and deserted became very thin. Some of these men tried to rejoin any friendly force they could find. Others gave up and settled wherever they happened to be. There are accounts of former soldiers integrating into rural communities, taking up simple work and living quietly under new identities. Not heroes, not villains, just people who, at some point, stopped moving with the army and started moving on their own. Interestingly, this period also saw the rise of more formal systems to track and identify soldiers. Records improved, descriptions were written down. In some cases, physical features were noted. It was an early attempt to make disappearing more difficult, but even then, it was far from foolproof. A determined individual, especially in a time of widespread movement and disruption, could still find ways to slip through the cracks. And then there's the emotional side, which tends to be quieter in official records, but shows up in letters and personal accounts. Soldiers writing home about exhaustion, about confusion, about a sense that the war has become too large, too distant from anything personal. And within those letters, you sometimes find a hint, not always stated directly, that the idea of leaving has crossed their mind, not as a dramatic rebellion, but as a quiet possibility. As we let this era settle, it becomes clear that even in one of the most organized military periods up to that point, the basic pattern hasn't changed. Armies grow larger. Systems become more refined. Leaders become more ambitious. But the individual soldier, standing somewhere in the middle of it all, still has the same thoughts, and sometimes, at the edge of a long road with no one watching too closely, he simply chooses not to keep going. As we slowly move toward the end of this long, quiet thread, the story of soldiers who fled the battlefield doesn't suddenly resolve into something neat or satisfying. It doesn't turn into a lesson about bravery winning over fear or discipline solving everything. Instead, it stays exactly what it has always been: uneven, human, a little uncomfortable to sit with. Because by the time we reach the modern era, especially the great wars of the 19th and early 20th centuries, desertion is still there, still happening. Even with better systems, stricter rules, and more organized armies. In fact, in some ways, the scale of modern warfare made the problem feel even larger, not smaller. Armies were no longer thousands. They were millions. And when you move millions of people into long, exhausting conflicts, some of them will leave during large-scale wars, especially those that dragged on without clear resolution. Soldiers often found themselves caught in a strange emotional space, not necessarily terrified in every moment, but deeply, quietly worn down. Days that blurred together, orders that felt distant, a sense that the individual didn't matter very much in the grand design. And within that space, the idea of leaving, of simply stepping out of the line, began to feel less like rebellion, and more like relief. Of course, the consequences were still serious. In many armies, desertion during wartime remained a capital offense. Some soldiers were executed, others imprisoned. Some were sent back to the front under strict supervision, given a chance to correct their mistake. The language around it stayed formal, controlled. Words like duty, honor, and discipline were used frequently. But behind those words, the reality was often quieter, because not everyone who left was trying to escape battle itself. Some were trying to escape everything around it: the waiting, the repetition, the constant uncertainty, the feeling of being part of something too large to understand and too heavy to carry for too long. And so, when an opportunity appeared, They took it. Sometimes desertion didn't even look like running. It looked like falling behind during a march. And not catching up. It looked like being sent on a small task. And never returning. It looked like blending into a group of civilians moving in the opposite direction. And simply continuing with them. Not dramatic, not loud, just absence. There were also soldiers who tried to leave, but couldn't quite make the separation complete. They lingered at the edges, not fully part of the army, but not entirely free either, moving cautiously, avoiding attention, living in a kind of in-between state that was neither safe nor stable. For them, desertion wasn't a clean break. It was an ongoing condition. And then there were the ones who came back. Not all deserters stayed away forever. Some returned voluntarily. Others were found and brought back. And in those moments, the system had to decide what to do. Punish? Forgive? Reuse? The answers varied, but one thing remained consistent. The army still needed people. So even those who had once walked away were sometimes folded back in, carefully, cautiously, with a watchful eye. What's perhaps most interesting, as everything settles, is how rarely these individuals appear in grand historical narratives. We hear about victories, defeats, strategies, leaders. But the quiet decisions, the moments when someone chose not to continue, are often left out. Not because they didn't matter, but because they don't fit easily into stories about glory or triumph. And yet they were always there. At the edge of the battlefield, at the back of the marching line, in the space between one order and the next. A soldier pausing, just long enough to think, just long enough to wonder, and then choosing something else. Sometimes that choice led to punishment, sometimes to survival, sometimes to a completely different life, far away from anything that looked like war. A small house, a quiet job, a name that didn't quite match the past, and a story that was rarely told in full. Because what do you say, really, that you were there? Until you weren't, that you followed, until you stopped, that at some point, in the middle of all that noise and movement and expectation, you decided to step out of it. Not loudly, not heroically, just quietly. And as we let the story come to rest, there's something almost strangely consistent about it. Across centuries, across empires, across all the changes in weapons, uniforms, and strategy, one small detail never disappears. The battlefield always has two directions, and while most men move forward, some, eventually, move the other way. Very slowly, very quietly, and then they are gone. If you gently drift back into the ancient world, far before mirrors were clear and lighting was flattering, beauty was already a very serious business. Not casual, not optional, and definitely not low effort. In fact, for many people, especially the wealthy-looking ideal was less of a preference and more of a daily responsibility. Because beauty, in ancient societies, was rarely just about appearance. It was tied to status, power, morality, and sometimes even whether the gods were supposed to like you or not. No pressure, of course. Take ancient Egypt, for example. A place where eyeliner wasn't just makeup. It was practically a lifestyle. Both men and women lined their eyes heavily with kohl. Not just for style, but also because it was believed to protect against the sun and even ward off evil spirits. Which is quite efficient, really. Looking fashionable while also spiritually defended. The ancient equivalent of multitasking. And if you happened to be someone like Cleopatra, well, the expectations were even higher. Beauty wasn't just personal, it was political. But here's where things become quietly exhausting. The ideal Egyptian look was not something you woke up with. Smooth skin, symmetrical features, carefully applied cosmetics, scented oils. It all required time, effort, and access to resources, which meant that beauty standards were, in many ways, a reflection of wealth. If you could afford the rituals, you could appear closer to the ideal. If not, well, you simply looked like reality. And reality has never been particularly fashionable. Now, if we slowly glide over to ancient Greece, the tone shifts slightly, but the pressure remains. The Greeks were deeply interested in symmetry and proportion, not just in buildings and statues, but in people. The perfect body was balanced, harmonious, mathematically pleasing, which sounds elegant, until you realize that very few actual humans fit neatly into geometric ideals. Philosophers like Aristotle had opinions on beauty, of course. Because why wouldn't he? Beauty was often linked to virtue. A well-proportioned body suggested a well-ordered soul, which is a lovely idea, unless you happen to have, say, an asymmetrical face or an inconveniently shaped nose. In that case, apparently your moral character might also be slightly questionable. A bit harsh, but that was the general vibe. And then there's the subtle irony. Many of the statues we associate with Greek perfection were, in fact, idealized versions of the human form. Not real people, carefully adjusted, smoothed out, balanced in ways that actual bodies rarely are. So in a sense, ancient Greeks were comparing themselves to artistic edits, which feels surprisingly familiar even now. Let's drift a little further into ancient Rome, where things become slightly more competitive. Roman society inherited many Greek ideas about beauty, but added its own layer of social ambition. Looking good wasn't just about harmony. It was about signaling your place in a very structured society. Pale skin, for instance, was highly valued among women, not because it was inherently better, but because it suggested you didn't have to work outside, which meant you were wealthy, which meant you were, by default, more desirable. Of course, achieving that pale look often involved some questionable methods. Lead-based cosmetics were quite popular, which, as you might suspect, was not ideal for long-term health. But beauty has always had a way of quietly ignoring practicality. The goal was the appearance. The consequences were a later problem. Hair was another ongoing project. Elaborate hairstyles, especially among elite Roman women, could take hours to create. Wigs were common. Hair dyes were used. And maintaining the correct look required constant attention. It wasn't something you achieved once and then relaxed. It was a daily commitment, a routine, a performance really. And underneath all of this, there's a pattern that starts to feel very familiar. Beauty standards were not just about aesthetics. They were about control, about shaping the body to match an ideal that was often created by people with power. And once that ideal was established, everyone else was expected to move toward it. Even if it was unrealistic, even if it was uncomfortable, even if it required a surprising amount of effort just to appear natural. Let's float gently over to ancient China, where beauty takes on a quieter, more restrained tone, but becomes no less demanding. Delicate features, small frames, and later, though not in the earliest periods, small feet became associated with elegance and refinement. The famous practice of foot binding, which developed in later dynasties, turned the idea of small into something quite extreme. Painful, permanent, and very difficult to ignore, despite the calm way it was often described. But even before that, the emphasis on softness, grace, and controlled movement created its own kind of pressure. Beauty was not just how you looked, but how you carried yourself, how you walked, how you spoke. Every small detail mattered, which meant that the performance of beauty extended into behavior. You didn't just look the part. You lived it. And as we let all of these ancient worlds settle together, Egypt, Greece, Rome, China, a quiet realization begins to form. The standards were different. The details changed. The styles shifted over time. But the underlying pattern remained almost exactly the same. Beauty was rarely simple. It was structured. It was maintained. And most of all, it was expected. Not loudly. Not always directly, but constantly. And for those living inside these systems, it wasn't something unusual or dramatic. It was just part of life, a routine, a quiet, ongoing effort to align yourself with an idea that was always just slightly out of reach, which, in a very calm and slightly ironic way, makes it feel surprisingly modern. If we let the scene continue to unfold, very slowly, one of the more curious patterns begins to settle into place. Across different ancient civilizations, people often claimed to admire what they called natural beauty. Simple, effortless, untouched. And of course, achieving that natural look required an impressive amount of preparation. Because in reality, very few people in the ancient world were just waking up and casually matching the ideal. Skin needed smoothing, hair needed arranging, faces needed adjusting, sometimes quite literally. And all of this had to be done in a way that looked like nothing had been done at all. Which, if you think about it, is a rather delicate balancing act. Let's drift back for a moment to ancient Egypt, where the concept of beauty extended far beyond simple appearance. Cleanliness, scent, and presentation were all part of the same quiet system. Bathing regularly was important. Oils and perfumes were used generously. The goal was not just to look good, but to feel composed, controlled, almost polished at all times. A kind of calm perfection that suggested you had everything in order, even if you absolutely did not. And yet, maintaining that calm perfection was not exactly effortless. Wigs were commonly worn, especially among the elite. Natural hair was often shaved or kept short for hygiene, while elaborate wigs were styled and maintained separately, which meant your hair could be adjusted depending on the occasion. Practical, yes, but also a reminder that beauty was something assembled, not simply possessed. If we gently shift back toward ancient Greece, the idea of effortless beauty becomes even more philosophical. The Greeks admired moderation, balance, the appearance of harmony without excess. So heavy makeup was often discouraged, at least in theory. A respectable woman was expected to look refined, not overly decorated, but again, this did not mean no effort. Light powders were used to pale the skin. Subtle pigments enhanced features. Hair was carefully arranged, often pinned or tied in controlled styles that required both time and skill. The difference was simply in presentation. The work had to remain invisible, because showing the effort would, in a quiet way, defeat the purpose. There's a certain irony here. The more a society praises natural beauty, the more carefully that appearance tends to be constructed. It's less about being natural, and more about appearing as though you are. Now, if we drift again into ancient Rome, things become slightly less subtle. Romans appreciated beauty, but they were also quite practical about achieving it. Cosmetics were widely used, even if some writers complained about them. Because of course they did. There's always someone quietly judging from the side. Women used powders, creams, and dyes to shape their appearance. Eyebrows were darkened, lips tinted, skin lightened. And while some philosophers suggested that too much enhancement was dishonest, the reality is that many people simply used what was available, because fitting the standard mattered more than philosophical consistency. Interestingly, Roman writers sometimes left behind very specific advice about beauty routines. Not in a dramatic or glamorous way, but in a slightly tired, instructional tone. Almost like they were describing a daily chore. Which, in many ways, it was. Maintaining appearance required repetition. The same steps, over and over again, every day. And then there's the matter of aging, which no beauty system has ever handled particularly gracefully. In many ancient societies, youth was strongly associated with beauty. Smooth skin, bright eyes, strong posture, all quietly linked to ideas of vitality and desirability. So as people aged, the effort required to maintain the ideal increased. More treatments, more adjustments, more careful presentation. Because the natural direction of time was not aligned with the preferred aesthetic. Some remedies were surprisingly creative, others were less advisable. Mixtures made from minerals, plants, and occasionally more questionable ingredients were applied in hopes of preserving youth. The results were mixed, at best, but the intention remained steady. to hold on to an image that was slowly, inevitably shifting. Let's gently move east again, back toward ancient China, where the idea of refinement becomes almost meditative. Beauty here was not meant to appear forced. Movements were slow, controlled, expressions were subtle. Even makeup, when used, was applied with a sense of restraint. The goal was harmony, not exaggeration, but achieving that harmony required discipline. Posture had to be practiced, gestures refined, clothing chosen carefully. It was not just about how you looked in a still moment, but how you existed over time, which quietly is far more demanding than a single appearance. And once again, we see the same pattern forming. Beauty is not an accident. It is a process, a routine, a set of repeated actions designed to maintain a specific image. And the more effortless that image is supposed to appear, the more carefully it tends to be constructed behind the scenes. As we let this part settle, there's something almost calming about the repetition of it all. The daily rituals, the small adjustments, the quiet effort to match an ideal that shifts just slightly beyond reach. Not dramatic, not sudden, just consistent. And in that consistency, the ancient world begins to feel very familiar, because even then, long before modern mirrors and cameras, looking natural was already a very carefully managed illusion. As we continue to drift, very gently, into the deeper layers of ancient beauty, the tone becomes just slightly heavier. Not dramatically so, nothing loud or shocking. Just a quiet realization that, for many people, beauty was not only time-consuming, it was sometimes uncomfortable, occasionally painful, and often accepted without much complaint, because it was simply the way things were done. Let's float back for a moment to ancient Rome, where appearance carried a certain weight in social life. Looking well-maintained was not just personal, it reflected your household, your status, your discipline. And so, various treatments were used to achieve that polished look. Some were harmless enough, others less so. Skin treatments, for example, often included substances that today might raise a few quiet concerns. Lead-based powders, as mentioned before, were used to create that pale, refined complexion. And while the effect may have looked elegant in soft candlelight, the long-term impact was understandably not ideal. But the connection between cause and effect wasn't always clear at the time. Or perhaps it was simply ignored in favor of immediate results. Because beauty, then as now, tends to prioritize the present moment over future consequences. Hair removal was another ongoing ritual. Smooth skin was considered desirable, particularly among the elite. So various methods were used: tweezing, scraping, even early forms of waxing. None of them especially relaxing. But again, not treated as unusual. Just another part of maintaining the expected appearance. Something done regularly, quietly, without much discussion. If we slowly shift our attention back to ancient Egypt, we find a similar pattern, though often presented with a slightly more graceful aesthetic. Egyptians valued smooth, hairless skin as well. Both men and women removed body hair, sometimes completely. It was associated with cleanliness, order, and refinement. And while the process could be uncomfortable, the result aligned with the broader cultural ideal of a controlled, polished body. Even cosmetics, which might seem gentle on the surface, could involve irritation or discomfort. Eye makeup, for instance, was applied frequently and heavily. While it had protective benefits against sunlight, it also required careful maintenance. Smudging, reapplication, the constant awareness of how you appeared, it all added up to a subtle, ongoing effort. Not painful in a dramatic sense, just persistent. Now as we drift east again toward ancient China, the conversation becomes quieter, but also more physically demanding in certain ways. While earlier ideals focused on grace and delicacy, later practices, especially foot binding, introduced a level of discomfort that is difficult to overlook, even when described calmly. The process began young. Feet were tightly bound to limit growth, creating the small curved shape that became associated with beauty and status. Over time, this altered the structure of the foot itself. Walking became slower, more controlled, which, interestingly, was also seen as elegant. A soft, measured step, a kind of refined movement that signaled both beauty and social position. But beneath that elegance, there was effort, and not the quiet, routine kind. The kind that required endurance, patience, acceptance, because once the process began, it was not easily reversed. And yet, within the culture, it was normalized, expected, even admired. There's a certain stillness in the way these practices were integrated into daily life. They weren't always questioned. They didn't always need explanation. They were simply part of the system. And for those living within it, the discomfort, whether mild or significant, was often just another detail. Something to manage. Something to live with. If we return briefly to ancient Greece, the physical discomfort may appear less obvious, but it's still there in quieter forms. The pressure to maintain a balanced, ideal body could lead to strict routines, controlled diets, regular physical training. Not necessarily painful in the same way as other practices, but still demanding, still requiring effort and consistency. And there's also the mental side, which tends to sit quietly beneath everything else. The constant awareness of how one appears, the need to align with expectations that are always just slightly out of reach, the subtle tension of maintaining an image over time. It doesn't make noise. It doesn't interrupt the day, but it's there, in the background. As we let all of this settle, the picture becomes a little clearer, though not necessarily more comfortable. Beauty, in ancient civilizations, was not just admired, it was maintained. And maintaining it often involved trade-offs: time, energy, comfort, sometimes even health. But none of this was presented as extraordinary. It was routine. Expected. Almost invisible in its repetition. And perhaps that's the most interesting part. Not the discomfort itself, but how easily it became part of everyday life. How something that required effort, adjustment, and occasional endurance could be absorbed so completely into the rhythm of existence. So that, over time, it no longer felt unusual at all. As we slowly move toward the end of this calm, winding path, the details begin to soften a little. Not because the expectations disappear, but because they become so familiar that they almost fade into the background. Beauty, by this point, is no longer just a collection of practices or standards. It becomes something quieter, a kind of ongoing performance that blends into daily life so completely. It hardly feels like a performance at all. If we gently look across all these ancient worlds, ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, and ancient China, a shared pattern settles in. The details change, the styles shift, the ideals evolve, but the rhythm remains almost identical. Wake up, adjust, maintain, present yourself, and then quietly repeat the process again the next day. It's not dramatic. It's not loud, it's just constant. And what's especially interesting is how early people seem to understand that beauty was, in many ways, something you did rather than something you simply had. It wasn't fixed. It wasn't guaranteed. It was built, layer by layer, through small, repeated actions. A little attention to skin, a little care with hair, a certain way of walking, a certain stillness in expression. None of it overwhelming on its own. But together, it formed a complete image. And that image mattered. Not always in obvious ways, not always openly discussed, but quietly, consistently, it shaped how people were seen, how they were treated, sometimes even how they saw themselves. Because when a society repeats the same ideals over and over again, they begin to settle into the background of thought. They become normal, expected, almost invisible. There's also a gentle irony that begins to surface here. Many of the standards were, in theory, about simplicity, natural beauty, effortless grace, balanced features, calm presence. And yet, achieving that simplicity required ongoing effort, careful routines, subtle corrections. A constant awareness of small details. It was simplicity. Carefully maintained. Even aging, which we touched on earlier, becomes part of this quiet performance. Not something openly resisted in dramatic ways, but something managed, adjusted, softened where possible. People adapted their routines as time moved forward. New methods, new habits, all with the same steady goal: to remain as close as possible to an ideal that never fully stayed still. And then, almost without noticing, beauty begins to blend into identity itself, not in a loud or defining way, but in small, repeated moments. The way someone carries themselves in public, the care taken before being seen, the subtle adjustments made without thinking. Over time, these actions stop feeling like effort and start feeling like habit, like part of who you are, rather than something you're actively doing. If we pause here for just a moment, there's something oddly calming about that repetition. Not the pressure itself, but the rhythm of it, the predictability, the quiet structure it gives to daily life. Because even though the standards could be demanding, they were also familiar. And familiarity, in its own way, can feel steady. Of course, not everyone could meet these expectations equally. Access to resources, time, and social position all played their part. The ideal was always just a little easier to reach for those who had more, and for everyone else. It remained something to approach, but rarely fully attain. A soft boundary, always present, always just slightly out of reach. But even then, people adapted. They found their own ways to fit into the system. Small adjustments, personal variations, quiet compromises between what was expected and what was possible. Because while the standards were consistent, real life was always a little more flexible. And as we let everything settle, the final picture feels less like a series of strict rules, and more like a gentle, ongoing pattern. One that stretches across time, across cultures, across countless individual lives. Beauty was never just about appearance, it was about routine, about repetition, about the quiet effort of aligning yourself, day after day, with something that always stayed just slightly beyond reach. And perhaps the most interesting part is how little that pattern has changed, because even now, in a world that looks very different on the surface, the rhythm feels familiar, the small adjustments, the careful presentation, the quiet awareness of how we are seen. It's all still there, just a little more modern, a little more polished, but following the same slow, steady pattern that began long ago. And as we gently come to rest here, there's no dramatic ending, no final conclusion to draw, just a quiet understanding that for thousands of years, across civilizations, languages, and shifting ideals, beauty has always been something we move toward, slowly, carefully, and never quite completely reaching. If we settle into this story very quietly and let the noise fade just a little, the first thing to understand is that confession in the world of witch trials was not really the end of anything. It didn't resolve the situation. It didn't bring peace. In many cases, it simply moved things along to the next stage, like turning a page that no one particularly wanted to read. Because when someone accused of witchcraft finally said yes, whether out of fear, exhaustion, confusion, or simply because it seemed like the only available answer, the system did not pause and reflect. It leaned forward, interested, almost relieved. Because a confession meant the process was working, at least from the perspective of those asking the questions. Let's drift for a moment to early modern Europe, where witch trials were most intense. In places like the region surrounding Salem or various parts of Germany, confessions became strangely detailed. Not because the accused suddenly felt inspired to share, but because they were often guided, carefully, patiently, sometimes repeatedly. Questions would be asked in ways that suggested the answers. And over time, those answers began to take shape. A person might start with a simple admission, yes, something happened. And then slowly, more details would be added. Meetings at night, strange figures, agreements made in quiet places. The stories often followed familiar patterns because those patterns were already expected. It wasn't creativity, it was alignment. And what's especially unsettling, in a very quiet way, is how these confessions were received. Not with shock, but with a kind of calm validation. Officials would write them down, record them carefully, sometimes even refine them, because a well-structured confession was useful. It confirmed beliefs that were already there. Now, you might assume that confessing would lead to some form of leniency, a reduced punishment, a second chance, something slightly softer, but the reality was less comforting. In many cases, confession did not remove the consequences. It simply changed their timing or form. Execution might still follow, just more formally. In some places, there was a quiet belief that confession allowed the soul to be saved, even if the body could not be spared, which sounds almost gentle, until you realize what it meant in practice. The person would still face punishment, often severe, but now it was framed as necessary, even helpful. Because at least in theory, they had admitted their wrongdoing. Let's float gently toward the experience itself. Not the system, but the individual sitting inside it. Imagine the slow accumulation of pressure, the repeated questioning, the lack of sleep, the sense that every answer is being measured against something you can't quite see, and eventually, the realization that the only way to end the questioning might be to agree, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, yes. And once that word is spoken, the process shifts, not ending, just changing direction. Now the focus turns to details, names, other people, additional events. Because a single confession often led to more accusations, the system expanded outward, like a ripple moving across still water. This is one of the more unsettling patterns. Confession was not isolated. It was connective. One person's admission could lead to several more investigations, and those, in turn, could lead to even more. So the act of confessing didn't just affect the individual. It extended the process, sometimes far beyond what anyone initially expected. There were also those who tried to manage their confessions carefully, saying just enough to satisfy the questions, but not so much that it became overwhelming. A delicate balance, difficult to maintain. Because once you begin telling a story under pressure, it has a way of growing, expanding, shifting slightly each time it's repeated, and the people listening were paying attention, very close attention. In some cases, those who confessed were kept alive longer than those who refused, not out of kindness, but because they were still useful. Their stories could be recorded, compared, used to support other cases. So survival, in these moments, was not always a sign of mercy. It was sometimes just a pause, a quiet delay. Eventually, though, most of these stories reached the same still conclusion. Confession did not undo the accusation, it confirmed it. It completed the narrative that the system was already building. And once that narrative felt complete, there was very little left to do. As we let this first part settle, the shape of it becomes clearer, though not necessarily easier to sit with. Confession was not a release. It was not a solution. It was a step. One that moved a person from uncertainty into something more defined. And often, more final. Not with noise, not with sudden change, just a slow, steady movement toward an outcome that had been quietly waiting from the very beginning. As we continue drifting through this quiet and slightly uneasy landscape, something a little unexpected begins to appear. Not everyone who confessed was immediately taken away to their final outcome. Some remained for a while. Not freely, of course, but present, observed, useful, in a way that is difficult to describe without sounding a bit detached. Because once a confession was given, the person didn't always disappear right away. Instead, they often became part of the process itself. Their words were recorded, repeated, and sometimes revisited. Officials might return with more questions, not because they doubted the confession, but because they wanted to expand it, gently, carefully, almost like adjusting a story so that it fit more neatly with everything else. Let's float again toward places like Salem, where this pattern becomes quietly visible. Some individuals who confessed were kept alive longer than others, not as an act of mercy, but because they were still considered informative. Their statements could be used to identify others, to confirm suspicions, to build a wider picture that stretched far beyond a single accusation. And so, for a time, these individuals existed in a strange in-between state, not free, not yet gone, just waiting. During this waiting period, there was often an expectation, sometimes spoken, sometimes not, that the confession would continue to grow. More names might be offered, more details added, because the system, once set in motion, rarely stayed still. It moved outward, always looking for connections, always trying to confirm what it already believed. This created a quiet kind of pressure, not always loud or forceful, but present. A sense that simply confessing once might not be enough, that more would be expected. And so some confessions became longer over time, not necessarily because new memories appeared, but because the situation encouraged expansion. There's also something gently unsettling about how these confessions were shared. They didn't stay private. They were discussed, circulated, sometimes even read aloud, not dramatically, but with a kind of official calm, as if the words themselves carried a certain authority now that they had been written down. And once something is written, it begins to feel fixed, even if it wasn't. Some who confessed were even brought into situations where they were asked to identify others, not always directly accusing, but confirming suspicions. A glance, a nod, a quiet agreement that yes, that person might also be involved. And in this way, the circle widened, slowly, almost gently, but steadily. Of course, not everyone participated willingly. Some tried to remain vague, to give as little as possible. But vagueness often led to more questions, more attention. So again, a balance had to be found. Enough detail to satisfy, but not so much that it became overwhelming. It's a difficult position to imagine fully, sitting in a place where your words carry weight, but not in a way that brings relief. Instead, they shape what happens next, not only for you, but for others as well. And all the while, time moves slowly. Days pass, questions return. Records grow, and the person at the center of it all remains in that same quiet space, neither fully present in the world nor completely removed from it. There were also moments, small, almost unnoticed, where doubt seemed to flicker, not openly, not enough to stop anything, but in the slight inconsistencies between different confessions, in the way stories sometimes shifted or overlapped in unusual ways. These details were often noted, but not always acted upon, because by that point, the system was already moving forward, and it rarely turned back. Eventually, though, this in-between state would come to an end. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just inevitably. The usefulness of the confession would fade. The questions would slow, and the process would reach its final stage. But for a while, there was this pause. This quiet extension of time where the person who had confessed remained part of the story, still speaking, still being listened to, still shaping what came next. Not out of choice, not out of control. Just because that's how the system worked. And as we let this part settle into place, it becomes clear that confession did not simply close a chapter. It opened another one, softer, perhaps quieter, but leading in the same steady direction as before. As we settle into the last layer of this story, there's a soft inevitability that begins to emerge. Not sudden, not shocking, just steady, like the slow sinking of the sun behind distant hills. The confession, which started as a word, a nod, a quiet admission, eventually carries the person toward the final stage. And here, the rhythm becomes almost mechanical. Not cruel in its presentation, just inevitable. In many European regions, Germany and France, for example, Confessions were carefully documented, sometimes repeatedly. Officials would check details, compare statements, ensure consistency. It was not about discovery anymore. It was about closure. Closure for the authorities, not the accused. The confession had become a tool, a record, a quiet instrument of administration. And so, the person who confessed would often wait. Wait while others' stories were woven into theirs. Wait while scribes wrote meticulously in dimly lit rooms. Wait as the system slowly, almost lethargically, aligned each detail. Days might pass, weeks, time stretched in a muted, careful way. Not meant to torment loudly, but to allow the machinery to operate fully. Interestingly, those who confessed sometimes experienced a strange sort of agency, not much certainly. But their words now carried authority. They shaped what came next. They confirmed or denied connections, and in that small, quiet sense of influence, some may have felt slightly empowered. A small, fleeting relief in an otherwise controlled existence. Yet even here, the weight of inevitability remained. Confession did not remove the final outcome. It only clarified it. The system's logic required that once the narrative was complete, the final step had to occur, not with spectacle, not with loud announcements, but with quiet precision. Because the machinery of belief, suspicion, and social order moved methodically, without drama. In some regions, like Salem, the final stage was almost ritualized. Confessors were acknowledged. Words were read. Their admissions were summarized in records that might outlive them. And then, the inevitable quietly descended. Execution, imprisonment, or public penance. The end stage was reached not with a flare, but with calm finality. The confession had done its part. The system had done its part. There was also a strange communal aspect. Other accused individuals were watching, listening, observing what confession meant in practice, how long it delayed outcomes, how it shaped the narrative. The quiet repetition of this pattern reinforced the larger system. It taught others what was expected, and what might happen if the same word, yes, was offered in turn. And after that, the world moved on, not dramatically, not immediately. Just in its usual, measured pace. Records were stored. Officials returned to other duties. The stories of the confessed became part of the fabric of local memory, quietly influencing subsequent cases. The individual, once at the center of attention, became another element in a slowly unfolding pattern that would continue elsewhere, in other towns, other years, other whispered inquiries. If we allow the mind to linger here, there is a certain muted melancholy in the scene. Confession was not liberation. It was not relief. It was a quiet acceptance of being part of a story much larger than oneself. A story built on fear, belief, and ritual. A story that had been repeating in different forms across regions, centuries, and societies. And yet, there is no shouting in this tale, no abrupt ending, no dramatic turn. Just the soft, steady conclusion of a narrative that had begun so subtly. Confession carried a person forward through observation, through expectation, through the careful machinery of order. And when the final step was taken, it was quiet, unremarkable, certain. Which, in a strange way, is exactly what the process had always been. Not loud, not sudden, not sensational. Just inevitable, slow, methodical, and quietly complete. So as we rest here, considering the ones who confessed, the ones who said yes and waited, it becomes clear that history often moves in soft rhythms, not in explosions or revelations, but in small admissions, repeated carefully, observed quietly, and eventually absorbed into the long, steady flow of human systems. And with that, the story of those who confess to witchcraft comes to its gentle, inevitable conclusion. Not with drama, not with fire and noise, but with the calm, persistent certainty of a world that had long known exactly what would happen next.